$4,900 limit per person per election.
Okay, and then, so one option would be to do nothing, but we might want to sort of say that we're doing nothing. We're calling the question or having a discussion about it as a full council, and not choosing to adopt a local ordinance that has any different requirements. Another option then would be to adopt a local ordinance that would, modify in whole or in part the provisions of AB 571.
Yes, you could have an ordinance that sets higher limits, lower limits, or no limits.
All right. So, Mayor Gordo and Councilmember Masuda, are you okay with going to public comment then? And or first the common cause presentation that we've arranged, and then to public comment. And as we do that, and I see no objections, so let's plan that way then. I would certainly like all of the speakers, including Common Cause, to help us focus on those options that we have, and which one might be preferable and why.
And Mr. Madison, this is Michelle Bonnery. Sorry to interrupt, but just one more point I wanted to make was that if we set limits that are different from the state's 4,900, either higher or lower, then we have to do our own enforcement. If we keep the 4,900, then the FPPC does the enforcement. And if there are no limits, then it's neither one. There's no enforcement of the limits. The FPPC would still enforce other campaign laws. So I just wanted
when you say enforcement, I think most of us are well familiar with the idea that sunshine is the best disinfectant, and so we all file regular reports with the city clerk, but they are filed on FPPC forms that are prescribed for us. Is that part of the enforcement mechanism that would change or go away? Or are you talking about something different when you say enforcement?
Well, I think that is encompassed. Let's say you don't file properly with whatever our requirements are, then we would have to enforce that. So it ranges from the forms to the penalties.
But if you assume we were to make changes, would we still then file the same forms, FPPC forms?
We could, yes. We could still file the same forms, but if we have a $10,000 limit, the FPPC isn't going to track to enforce if somebody got $11,000 from someone or something like that.
Okay. When you say we could, wouldn't we?
We would use their forms.
We would still be legally required to publish this information and publicly file it on their forms. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. We have 17 public comments at last count, and then I've asked Common Cause, we have to give a 5 to 10 minute presentation on this. Should we limit the public comments to 2 minutes, just being mindful of the 4 p.m. deadline that we have for our meeting?
That would probably be good.
I'm good.
Yeah, I see no objection to that. So that'll be the case. And I'd ask, while Common Cause is presenting, if those of you who have do intend to make public comment, please be mindful that you'll be limited to 2 minutes. And again, I'd ask all of you as well to focus on the options available to us and what option you believe is preferable. Okay, is it Jonathan Maida-Stein from Common Cause? Is that our guest?
Yes, Chair. That's
yes, Councilmember. Thank you for inviting me. Should I turn my video on or leave it off? Do you have a preference?
Certainly welcome to turn it on if the staff can accommodate that.
Great. Hello.
Thank you, sir. Hi. Welcome.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. It's really lovely to join all of you for this conversation, and we appreciate the invitation to join you on really important subject matter. My name is Jonathan Maida-Stein. I'm the Executive Director at California Common Cause. We are a democracy reform and good government organization that works towards accountable representative democracies at the local and state levels in California. We were supporters of AB 571 at the time of its introduction and passage. And while we'll express our organizational views to you today, our primary role this afternoon is to engage in a substantive exchange of ideas with you about various pros and cons. In conversation with city staff, they instructed me to plan for a 10-minute presentation. So, Mr. Councilmember, I hope that's okay. All right. So some background. At the time of AB 571's introduction in the state legislature, there were no limits on contributions to candidates for local office in 78% of California's cities and 72% of California's counties. In these jurisdictions, contributors could give unlimited amounts to candidates for local office. And in the years immediately prior to AB 571's introduction, there were examples of contributions of $50,000, $100,000, and even one of $244,000, all to candidates for local office from donors who had business before the local government in question. Such massive campaign contributions obviously created a very serious risk of actual or perceived corruption. So, AB 571, as the council has already discussed, says that beginning January 1st of this year, a state campaign contribution limit will by default apply to city and county candidates if the city and county has not enacted its own contribution limit on local candidates. That limit is $4,900 and will be adjusted for inflation. That amount can be raised, importantly, in both a primary and a general election. So why contribution limits generally? Our view is that unfettered, unlimited money in our politics creates the danger of corruption in three forms: what I will call acute or quid pro quo corruption, what I will call legalized corruption, and what I will call perceived corruption. So acute corruption is when candidates can receive massive checks that compose the majority of their campaign war chest. They do so from a single source that has interest in front of city politics. Obviously, you're creating an environment that is vulnerable to corruption. That may not be a danger that you think is likely with the current city council. That's understandable, but you have to think, of course, about future city councils in the city of Pasadena. A 2020 study out of UC Berkeley found a direct link between looser campaign contribution limits and donor kickbacks and government contracts awarded to campaign donors that did not perform well in the public interest. So that's the acute corruption that there's a danger of. Then I would say what I call legalized corruption. When money swamps our political system, even when quid pro quo corruption or bribery are not occurring, you still have the subtle tilting of the policymaking process in favor of those who give. This may be subtle as the fact that candidates spend more of their time in conversations with those who write big checks. A 2014 Princeton study showed that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests had substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups, those who do not donate in equivalent amounts, had little to no independent influence as the data could find. So there is this tilting of the policy landscape, subtle as it may be, towards those who donate more. And then lastly, there is the danger of perceived corruption. Even if you're sure there's no risk of quid pro quo corruption in Pasadena, and even if you're sure that the city council would not shift its policy priorities towards those who are giving, we would urge you to recognize that perceptions of trust, credibility, and legitimacy in our local politics are critically important. We live in an era where it feels like there is an ongoing crisis in our democracy basically every day of the week. Trust in our democratic institutions at the national and the state levels are cratering. I think you need to look no further than the outpouring of public participation on this topic that you've seen in the last few weeks to see that people really will decide how much faith they have in Pasadena's local government based on the decision you'll make here on this topic. I think it's clear if you just look at our democracy today that a government swamped with big money just isn't credible in the eyes of Americans or of Californians. So we think that the wisdom of Pasadena setting some municipal contribution limit is pretty clear. But the question then becomes, what would the right contribution limit be? I think there's a danger of setting it too high, as I've already discussed, and also a danger of setting it too low. So state candidates the state legislature has decided that in their wisdom, the right amount for state candidates is $4,900 adjusted for inflation. but they represent in the state assembly of almost 500,000 people each, and in the state senate, they represent almost 1 million each. Pasadena's total population is 141,000, and each council member represents about 20,000 people. So what contribution limit fits Pasadena and its size? We wanted to bring some data to bear on this question. So we looked at 15 cities with populations of $100,000 to $150,000, right? So you get a wide range of outcomes. Berkeley's 121,000. It's got a donor limit of 250, pretty low. Concord's 129,000 people. It has a contribution limit of 1,000. The city of Orange has a population of 139,000. It has a contribution limit of 1,000. Murrieta has a population of 116,000. It has a contribution limit of 1,100, excuse me. Roseville, 142,000 people, a contribution limit of 500. Torrance, a population of 144,000, a contribution limit of 1,000. So looking at those 15, I didn't list all of them, but looking at those 15, the highest contribution limit is 2,500. The lowest contribution limit is 150. The mode or most common contribution limit is 1,000. The median is 560, and the average is about 800, just under 800, okay? So it's subjective, and you can fall anywhere in that range, but most cities that have donor limits that are roughly Pasadena size appear to get along fine with the contribution limit of about 1,000 or slightly lower. And keep in mind that you can set different contribution limits for people running for council seats and people running for mayor, because the mayor is trying to reach a larger section of the population. I also want to flag some Pasadena campaign finance data for you as you think through this question. We took a look at the 2020 campaign finance reports for Pasadena electives, the first year that Pasadena held its elections on the state primary date. And they show the vast majority of contributions from a single source were well below $5,000, so that state default number. The most common or mode single contribution in the 2020 Pasadena primary in general was $100. The average contribution was $868, and the median contribution was $250. So the state's default contribution limit, which is substantially higher than the limits used by comparable cities, really wouldn't impact your politics very much at all, given how people are donating in your politics. And $1,000 contribution limit, or something in that range, would be similar to comparable cities and would be comfortably above your mode, your mean, and your median donations. Now, I said earlier that there's at least some danger in setting the limit too low. Setting the contribution limit too high, or not setting the limit at all, creates the danger of real or perceived corruption, as I discussed earlier. But setting the limit too low also creates its own issues. And so let's spend some time on that topic. One, setting the contribution limit too low may create constitutional concerns. The Supreme Court has consistently said that contribution limits are permissible, but setting them too low raises questions of whether freedom of speech is being infringed or chilled. And we're talking about a contribution limit of $100, $200, something that's very small like that. Second, candidates need to raise money for their campaigns. Elections are expensive. Unfortunately, this is a reality of American politics. An extremely low contribution limit may not enable candidates to raise enough funds to run effective campaigns. And third, there is this argument that setting the contribution limit too low will result in more money flowing to independent expenditures. Now, I don't want to overstate this. We have not seen a robust data analysis that documents a reliable connection between low contribution limits and increased IEs. But it does make intuitive sense. If you limit donors to $200 per cycle, they will find somewhere else to put their political money, and presumably independent expenditures would be where that money goes. IEs create a variety of problems you're all very familiar with. Primary among them is decreasing democratic accountability. If independent expenditures say something crazy or outrageous that is deeply unfair to a candidate or degrades the city's politics, voters can't hold the creators of those IEs accountable by voting them out of office. Another concern often raised about IEs is transparency. The worry is that by lowering contribution limits too low, we push more political money into the dark. I would push back on that idea in particular. While you cannot stop IEs, thanks to the Roberts Court and the Citizens United decision, you do have the right to insist on transparency for IEs, either requiring on-ad disclosures for those who pay for the IEs or requiring that all IEs in the city of Pasadena be filed with the Pasadena City Clerk's office and posted on the city's website. These are steps that have been taken by other California cities, and they're used at the state level as well. In California, our state politics require the disclosure of the true source of independent expenditure funding, both in disclosures and on ad political advertising. There's one additional issue that I won't have time to discuss in my comments because I'm about to wrap up, and that's the idea of whether or not contribution limits are unfair to challengers. I would be happy to discuss that in Q&A if it's of interest to the council. In conclusion, our recommendation would be to use a contribution limit to make sure that that contribution limit is neither too high nor too low, and that your politics comfortably fit a contribution limit that is used commonly in similarly sized cities around the state. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Chair, I would like Mr. Mehta to, first, thank you, Mr. Mehta, for joining us, but I would like you to address that final point of whether contribution limits favor incumbents versus challengers. I think that's an important point.
I agree.
I'm
That's
happy to
an
do so.
important question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So there is some concern that if you set the contribution limit too low, you are not equipping challengers with the money they need to run an effective campaign, and the incumbency advantage that is held by those already in office will dominate. If no one can raise enough money, no one can run effective campaigns, and the people who already have name recognition are going to be repeat winners. But there is very little evidence that setting no contribution limit or very high contribution limit helps challengers. There's just no data to support that conclusion. Studies appear to find a negligible impact or find that contribution limits reduce incumbency advantage and aid challengers. Why is that? It's because incumbents have a deeper bench of donors, and incumbents have more connections to the city's powerful players and interests. Incumbents are consistently better able and better positioned to raise large dollar donations than challengers. That's not true in every single instance, of course, but it is the case that systematically, incumbents are better positioned to raise large dollar checks. So a very small contribution limit could hurt challengers, but a very high contribution limit also could hurt challengers and could very disproportionately advantage incumbents and those who already hold power. Does that help?
I think it's a good start.
Okay, any other questions for Mr. Stein, Mayor, or Councilmember Masuda?
Thank you very much. It was very informative. Thank you.
Pardon? Mayor?
I'm sorry, I'll reserve until after public comment.
Chair, I just want to
Okay.
confirm with Mr. Stein that he had mentioned he had another engagement, may have to step off. So I did want to mention that so that you were aware and you could adjust if necessary.
Thank you. I had just a couple of follow-ups also as well. It was interesting. You went through them expeditiously, which was appropriate, but I was listening to the list of cities, and I'm not sure I heard a city that's analogous to Pasadena in the sense that I want to describe right now, which is in our city, we of course have district representation for council and then a citywide elected mayor. Wouldn't it disadvantage a resident, be a council member, him or her, or not, that was running for mayor versus another candidate, if the first candidate is from a economically disadvantaged district and the opponent is from a highly advantaged? And we do have, in many ways, Pasadena is a microcosm of, frankly, the entire country, or much bigger cities, in the sense that we have a range of incomes and neighborhoods and the like. And one argument that I've heard that is not frivolous to me is the idea that, for example, in my district, where there's a high household income, I might have the ability to raise numerous, pick whichever limitation you might apply, 500, 1,000, 2,500. But if another candidate who is either from or represents a part of the city that doesn't have that kind of broad-based economic affluence will have a much harder time doing that. And doesn't that augur then in favor of higher limits or no limits, so that there's a platform, there's sort of an equal playing field. That is to say that that other candidate could, by just attracting a few larger contributions, be able to compete. But I think the one thing none of us disagrees with, right, is, you know, that campaigns are commercial enterprises, and it's very expensive, even in local races sometimes, to run an effective campaign that puts one's message and one's qualifications out for the voters to see. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
I'd be happy to. So, Councilmember, I first of all, I appreciate the specific attention on equity issues around this topic and making sure that people from all backgrounds and from all neighborhoods within the city are able to run for office effectively. We share that concern. I would disagree with your analysis, though. I have 4 different responses. The first is, I think it's been pretty definitively shown in the social science and the data that as money's role in our politics increases, it causes harm to low-income communities and communities of color. And that's because as long as we have a racial wealth gap in this country, and we do, it is going to mean that certain communities have more money to finance campaigns for their supported candidates than others. And so so if you have everybody spending less, then a community-backed candidate who's raising in small dollar amounts might be competitive. But if everybody's raising in larger amounts, the people from the wealthier communities are going to be able to access the big checks and others won't. Now, there is a solution to, and also I would argue, Councilmember, that the solution is not for an individual from a low-income community or a community of color to raise a couple massive checks. That might enable them to run a viable campaign, but then they are hyper-concentrated in their dependency on a couple key contributors, which raises a variety of other democratic concerns, right? Despite allowing them to run an effective campaign. The solution in our eyes is to use other mechanisms, to other reforms to make it more plausible for candidates from those neighborhoods to run. So a number of cities have explored, like the city of Los Angeles, the city of Berkeley, public financing systems that use small government funds to match small dollar donations. I don't want to get into the details of that now, but they have consistently been shown to increase the diversity of the donor pool and increase the diversity of candidates. So unfortunately, I don't agree with the analysis. I would also point out to you, Councilmember, that there are some cities that are analogous, I think, to Pasadena. So the city of Orange, for example, has 6 by-district seats and an at-large mayor, a population of 139,000. And now, in those respects, I think it's very similar to Pasadena. It uses a $1,000 contribution limit. Simi Valley has 4 council seats by district, including an at-large mayor, a population of 126,000. They use a contribution limit of $1,000. To your last point, though, I think that there's real validity in questioning whether somebody running for mayor from one part of town and somebody running for mayor in a different part of town with dramatically different background and neighborhood resources are going to be in a fair fight. And I think you could, if you'd like, examine the possibility of setting one contribution limit for your city council candidates and one contribution limit, a higher one perhaps, for your mayoral candidates, because they're running to convince a larger pool of voters. I hope that's responsive.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And please, you said a couple of times your analysis. Please understand I'm asking a question. I don't necessarily endorse or subscribe to that view, but I have heard that view expressed more than once by people whom I respect a great deal. My final question, Mr. Stein, for you was just with IEs, as you said, and you kind of said it quickly, and I probably tend to agree with you, I would imagine, about Citizens United, but it is the law of the land. So we can't prohibit IEs. What are you suggesting? That, as I understand, there are already fairly muscular disclosure requirements for IEs statewide. Am I wrong about that under the statewide Political Reform Act of 1974?
Yes, though you'd have to check with your city council and the FPPC to understand which of those disclosure requirements, which are quite good at the state level, extend to the local level. I know Oakland, for example, where I live, has additional disclosure requirements at the city level on top of what's required by the state. And one of them is that it's really simple. but very effective. They require everyone who issues an independent expenditure in the city of Oakland to submit it to the city's ethics commission, which then houses them all on one website. So if you get something in the mail, and then attached to the image is donor information and a variety of other information about where they're spending money in local politics. And so if you get a mailer and it's attacking somebody and you're like, what is going on here? It's only a couple clicks away to find out much more information about where that's coming from. And I think those sorts of municipal efforts to bring additional disclosure around IEs can be quite useful, given that, as you know, under the Roberts Court, we're not going to be able to stop them or really regulate them.
And so where does it stop, though? I mean, for example, is putting a yarn side in one's yard an independent expenditure of, you know, a free lease of a small square footage of real estate? Is volunteering at a coffee, donating one's independent labor? And I guess that wouldn't be an IE because you'd be acting at the direction of the campaign, presumably, if you volunteered for a campaign-sponsored event. But presumably there are limits or you know, floors to and definitions about that.
Absolutely, and those floors are totally appropriate. You know, these regulations have to be developed carefully. We are not of the position that disclosure should be absolute, because at a certain point you make political activity so onerous for the smallest actors that you're actually dissuading people from engaging in their city's politics, and we don't want to do that. So when we participate in you know, policymaking at the state level, we're very careful to say, make sure that you're only regulating, you know, major or medium-sized actors, and you're only getting real, you know, real spending, and you know, these sorts of things are important. So you wouldn't want to incorporate a lawn sign into any sort of disclosure regime, but you could say that an independent expenditure worth $10,000 or more, for example, you know, in certain of certain kinds. Would need to be disclosed to the city and then posted on the city's website, those sorts of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Well, I understand you may have to slip away. We're really grateful for your offer to present today. And then obviously you are someone who has thought very seriously and deeply about this topic. So we're really grateful. Mayor Gordo, I want to make sure if you were to have any more questions for Mr. Stein, that you're able to ask them, and Councilmember Masuda the same.
I didn't realize Mr. Stein was stepping away, and so I would like the opportunity to ask some questions. So you mentioned Torrance in the city of Orange. Do you know what for a city council election or for a citywide seat, the electorate size might be for those cities?
Well, yeah. So I can, the city of Orange as an example, I'm going to pull out the calculator on my cell phone, but we can do this relatively quickly. The city of Orange has 139,000 people divided by 6 council seats, and so they've got 23,000 people in each council district. And the city of Pasadena has roughly 20,000. No,
but the registered voters and the electorate, the people who are actually.
Oh, I don't.
Okay.
I don't.
I think that's
we did not have the opportunity to do that data analysis.
That's what's missing when I hear a comparison. And so let me ask you, how have contribution limits worked out in the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles and the state legislator from your perspective, and from the perspective of Common Cause in terms of getting money out of the political process?
Well, it's certainly the case that 571 has achieved its primary goal, which is that it has stopped the really egregious campaign donations at the local level that are, you know, I mean, like I said, donations were being given of $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 that were basically one corporation, one industry, or one donor would be single-handedly bankrolling a candidate for local office. That's no longer the case because of 571, and we think that's a victory. You know, there are other cities like Los Angeles, which is, I mean, we are constantly criticizing the city of Los Angeles for a culture of corruption at City Hall. I don't think there's any evidence that can be shown, though, that that culture of corruption is connected to the city's use of contribution limits.
So not to belabor the point, but the contribution limits that were in place in the city of Los Angeles, in the county, and the state were not affected by AB 571. Those were already in place prior to, correct?
I believe so, yeah. I mean, certainly for the city, and I don't know the city and county's history, but I think they've had contribution limits for quite a long time.
And so what's the history of people being able to challenge incumbents in the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles and the state legislature? Would you say that contribution limits have improved a challenger's position in any of those jurisdictions or harmed the ability of people to challenge an incumbent?
Yeah, you know what, I would argue that the city of Los Angeles is hard to analyze because its use of matching funds. And I'm happy to talk about public financing in greater depth if it's interesting, but the city of Los Angeles has a limit of $800. But then what's really critical is that it matches small dollar donations with public dollars, which means that if you're a regular Joe from the community, a community leader, but not well connected to networks of power and influence and money, you can raise small dollar donations. And because they're matched by public funds, you are able to mount a credible campaign. So that's both really, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I'll conclude. I think that's really important and a huge win for the residents of LA, but it also makes LA so rare and unique that it's hard to do an apples to apples comparison between the city of Los Angeles and the city of Pasadena or even other major cities.
And at what point do you qualify for public financing? There's a threshold, and what would that threshold be?
So I'm not familiar with the specifics of LA. It's been a really long time since I was deep in those details. But what I can say is that every matching fund system and every voucher system, those are the two primary kinds of public financing systems right now. Candidates, in order to qualify, have to do a number of things to show their viability and their credibility. So you have to raise, let's say, 5,000 signatures, and you have to raise 200 donations of $20 or less, or something along those lines, to show that you're going to be a real candidate and make good use of public dollars.
I think the threshold is much higher than that. It probably, my recollection is, it's much higher than that before you qualify.
In the city of Los Angeles, it almost certainly is, given its size. I'm thinking of like the city of Berkeley, the city of Seattle, and other cities that are using public financing as well.
Yeah, and the cost of elections as the result of campaign limits, has that decreased in Los Angeles and the state? And the county board of supervisors have yet taken the money?
I don't have that analysis. Yeah, I don't have that analysis. Given that contribution limits go back so far in those various jurisdictions, sir, I just would assume that you'd have to do a multi-decade analysis, and I just do not have that for you. I'm sorry.
Well, that would be an interesting analysis to conduct, because from what I see, it's actually not decreased the cost of an election in any one of those jurisdictions. And so let me ask the question, assuming that the cost of an election hasn't gone down, who's paying for these elections? Is it candidates or independent expenditures, or both?
You know, I think what's important to note is that there's so if the cost of campaigns hasn't gone down, but the contribution limits are in place, what that means is the candidates need to raise from more people, which I think is a net positive. It democratizes our democracy. If you have to go raise smaller dollar amounts from more constituents, I think that's a net positive, even though it means that you might spend more time fundraising by walking the block and holding fundraisers and so on, because you're speaking to more people and getting more people engaged. So, you know, I think that's a good thing. More money flowing into independent expenditures is not a good thing, but I think that those are, unfortunately, a separate issue.
Well, I don't view it
maybe
as
I misunderstood the question. I hope I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, no, I don't view it as a separate issue. I think it's right on point. I recently ran a campaign for mayor in Pasadena, and I made a commitment to not take money from developers, from the cannabis industry, from police officers, from apartment owners associations, and so did my opponent. In some case, well, actually, no, my opponent said, "I'll take money from anybody," but didn't want to reveal that money was being taken. So I'd like to show you what happened and get your reaction to this. So I made a commitment to not take money from developers, cannabis, police, and apartment owners, but that was the decision I made as a candidate. And, there's a consequence to pay for that. I relied more and more on residents and residents in Mr. Madison's district and my district and Mr. Masuda's district and throughout the city. And it was difficult, but this is what happened because my opponent didn't want to say publicly that he was accepting money from people like the Apartment Owners Association. We got an independent expenditure, and this is just one of some, an independent expenditure from Sacramento. And if you look here, you'll see the independent expenditures for $35,000 to essentially support my opponent and attack me. And I was able to respond by going to residents and saying, we had this mailer land all the way from Sacramento. My opponent is able to say, that wasn't me. I have nothing to do with it. That's some Apartment Owners Association. This happened 2 weeks after I refused to meet with the Apartment Owners Association. My opponent did meet with them and was rewarded with a $35,000 independent expenditure. So if you can turn to the next page.
Go down, there you go.
All right, yeah. Can you tell me by looking at this, who contributed the money for that independent expenditure?
Go in a little bit farther, there you go.
Beyond the name of the filer, Mr. Mayor, in the top left corner?
Yeah.
Well, so let me address a couple of things that you've raised. The first is, first of all, I admire your stance to not take special interest money in a local campaign. That's incredibly important, and you were able to overcome that, which many candidates aren't able to do, which is great. I would note, though, that contribution limits would not have impacted that dynamic because your opponent said he wouldn't take any money. So if he was allowed to take $10,000 from them or $1,000 from them, it wouldn't have ultimately mattered because he was going to take $0 from them and push the money to IEs instead. So this is an unfortunate reality in our politics because of Citizens United, but contribution limits aren't going to make this happen or not make this happen.
Maybe I misspoke. He said he would take money from any source, but the problem is he didn't want to admit to my opinion, didn't want to admit to the voters that he was accepting money from the Apartment Owners Association. So one way to get around that was to do an independent expenditure, and that independent expenditure would have been affected. It had been contributed directly to my opponent in two ways. One, it would have had to have been reported and very clearly reported. And two, there would have to have been an admission that he was accepting dollars from the California Apartment Owners Association. Now, if you look at my reports, it's very clear who contributed to my campaign, and it's very clear where those people live. But here, I don't see any information that would tell the residents of Pasadena who was contributing dollars in our race for mayor of Pasadena. And that's my concern.
So, yeah, I understand that, Mr. Mayor, and we should know where the dollars are coming from in the mayor's race or any other race. And so under the California Disclose Act, which is state law, an independent expenditure needs to carry the name of the entity that authorized the ad and the top 3 donors. And if it's not the case that independent expenditures in Pasadena carry that same information, it's within your power to pass an ordinance that would require that disclosure of independent expenditures, so your voters know where the money is coming from. But again, and we may be misunderstanding each other, but from what I understand, if a candidate doesn't want to take money from a sullied source, the nature of the contribution limit ultimately doesn't matter because the money is so toxic, they're not going to take it regardless of what the contribution limit is, and they're going to encourage that toxic source to push the money into independent expenditures. So that's troubling, but in my mind, it is an independent question from where you set the expenditure limit, whether the expenditure limit should be 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 or whatever the case may be.
But isn't that what you've seen happen in other jurisdictions like Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles and in fact in the state legislature where independent, the candidates go around, they'll raise the minimal amount, and then an independent expenditure is formed. And the independent expenditure actually ends up spending more money on the campaign than the candidate did. Would you agree with that?
Of course. So, for example, I live in Oakland, and there was a soda tax on our ballot, and there was hundreds of thousands of dollars in independent expenditures on both sides on the soda tax. If the contribution limit is set at 1,000 or 4,000, it is not going to impact whether those hundreds of thousands are used in independent expenditures. That money is going to flow to independent expenditures regardless of what the contribution limit is. Those entities are going to max out their contribution directly to the campaign for 1,000 or 4,000 or 5,000, and then they're going to put 120,000 in an independent expenditure, right? The specific the contribution limit, Mr. Mayor, I would argue, is less tied to outcomes on independent expenditures than I think we disagree on the degree to which the nature of the nature of the contribution limit impacts independent expenditures. I think independent expenditures have a life of their own in many respects, and a contribution limit of a 500 versus 4,000, it doesn't impact them as much as one might think.
Now, one final question, and then I'll turn it back to the chair. But one of the things I was able to do is say I'm not going to accept money from certain sources, and I was actually told, well, if you don't, we're going to run an independent expenditure against you. And I was able to respond, well, you go ahead and do that, and I will raise the money to defeat it. So let's take, for example, a political action committee that has $500,000. Wouldn't you agree that it puts a candidate at a disadvantage if that independent PAC, political action committee, can say to a member of the city council, vote with us or support us, or we're going to spend half of that war chest, making your life very uncomfortable in the next election?
Yeah, I think there's real concerns there, Mr. Mayor. I think that if you are going to be a candidate who swears off, special interest money, for example, and you're not going to get as many independent expenditures on your side because you don't want to align yourself with special interests, and an entity is going to drop $100,000 IE against you, your contribution limit needs to be set such that you're able to fundraise effectively. You're able to use people power to fight back against the massive independent expenditures. But to use a contribution limit of 20,000 or 50,000 then replicates the same special interest problems that you're experiencing with the independent expenditure, right? You're not beholden to the special interest that's funding the independent expenditure or threatening the independent expenditure. But by raising a check of $30,000, there's other questions of democratic accountability there and perceptions around sort of integrity of our elections. So there's issues on both sides, but I take your point on this point, Mr. Mayor. I think it's very legitimate.
Isn't the fact of as long as I'm disclosing it, who I'm raising money, isn't that a matter for the voters to decide, to look and see, look, one candidate's raising money from, you name the source, but it's disclosed, and then the voters can decide, versus an independent expenditure where we don't know where the money's coming from. We just know it's coming from somewhere in Sacramento. What would you say is the better and more transparent process?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Mayor, I understand your point. I do. And there's if you've got big money can flow to one of the two places, I suppose it makes more sense for the big money to flow to the candidates directly. But the reality is that you're creating a wide variety of additional problems. If you have a $35,000 donation from, or let's say your opponent has a $35,000 donation from an apartment association, yes, the public can see that, but it is going to torpedo the public's trust in your local politics if they know that special interest groups are able to make $35,000 donations directly to city council candidates. So there's pros and cons to both sides, I would argue. And ultimately, also, Mr. Mayor, if I may, just to make one additional point here, I'm not sure how many voters go check campaign fundraising reports before they cast their ballots. I do think that it's important to have the prophylactic effect of contribution limits, because disclosure of campaign contributions does not get us all the way to an ethical and responsive democracy.
Well, I tend to trust the voters on that point. I think the voters are more aware than you and I, but I would suggest to you that on this independent expenditure that was, and this is one of just some that was run against me, that the voters did not know because, well, they didn't know the source of the funds. All they know is it came from some independent PAC in Sacramento. When I compare that to my contributions, every one of them is listed, and the voters can decide whether they wanted to support me based on where my support is coming from. And I think it's a very different situation. I'll give you one more example, is when I said no to some in the cannabis industry, I ended up with a recall. And again, you know, this is simply because I wouldn't meet with people because they had business before the city. So I ended up with a recall. I wish I brought my sign that said recall Gordo. I'll bring it to the city council meeting. And you know, that again, I was able to look at people and say, you can run this recall, but I'm going to raise the money to defeat it. And I stood my ground. With campaign contributions, that independent expenditure to run a recall against me as a member of the city council, I would have been very limited and maybe not in a position to say, unless I self-funded, to say, no, I'm holding my ground. And so I'll leave it with that. I think I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Stein. Councilmember Masuda, I'm mindful of time, but I want to make sure I give you an equal opportunity if you have any further follow-up with Mr. Stein.
Mr. Stein was very knowledgeable, and I really appreciate his explanation on many topics. Thank you, Mr. Stein.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stein. Then let's move to public comment. I'm now concerned, given that we have a constraint at 4 p.m., that 2 minutes per speaker may not work with our schedule, but why don't we start and try as best we can? And I'd ask Madam Clerk to begin to cue the speakers.
I would like to first report that the City Clerk's office received 26 letters of correspondence related to the item, which were distributed to the committee and posted online. The first speaker is Dr. Denise Robb, followed by Una Lee.
Welcome, Dr. Robb.
Oh, thank you. I also want to answer that question you just asked before I start, that there are no recalls are different. They don't have the same limits in California. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm a professor of political science and my doctoral research is in elections. And I'm here to ask you not to remove the $4,900 limits that were imposed in January. If you do remove them, it should be to lower them, not to have unlimited money. So I stand with Councilmember Rivas and my own Councilmember Wilson. In the last hearing, Mayor Gordo was talking about independent expenditures as well as this one. He said that, you know, you need more money, unlimited money to deal with that. There's things you can do, and I'd love to talk to you about things you can do. But we have, you know, independent expenditures, Citizens United, 501c4s, but that's a different issue. That's not what you're voting on today. There's not a connection between the two. There's no data with connections between the two. Today, you're voting on whether or not you want to remove limitations, and that's bad for democracy. It makes no sense as well. I looked at your donations. I looked at all of your donations. Almost nobody's given over $4,900, almost zero. And the cities that were mentioned today have 250, 500, 800. You don't need 4,900. So 77% of Americans agree with what I'm saying. Most of everyone in Pasadena, all your speakers, your constituents agree with this. And even if it only helps with the appearance of democracy, it does help with democracy. but it's also the perception. You don't want to give any more bad ideas to people about how democracy is corrupt. So please do the right thing. We're begging you, we're asking you, we're pleading.
Your time
you.
has expired. Please
Excuse
conclude
me,
your comments.
Madam Clerk, I just want to point out though that Dr. Rob, just to put a pin in this, that $35,000 independent expenditure would be exponentially more powerful though in a race where the opponent was, which in this case was not the incumbent. The incumbent couldn't raise funds to sort of match that, these limits. So essentially we're powerless over the IEs, and yet you're proposing that we impose stern limits on the contributions. Wouldn't that necessarily advantage someone that can access the Apartment Owners Association, for example, for tens of thousands of dollars of IEs? I guess that'll be a rhetorical question that we'll have to come back to. Go ahead, Ms. Ford.
Well, and just to put a pin in it, and the access to that apartment owners associations came through the power of incumbency. And Ms. Robb is correct. I did not raise very many checks over $4,900, but it's not an incumbent that I'm worried about. It's a challenger to any one of us that I believe should be able to raise the dollars.
Next speaker is Una Lee, followed by Dr. Andrea Davis.
Hello. Is that working?
Welcome, Ms. Lee. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. I'm Una Lee Yost, PhD parent and local schools advocate, and I rise in support of the October 18 open letter sent to Pasadena City Council, written in strong opposition to the proposed ordinance to codify no limits on campaign contributions. The coalition of open letter signers now includes almost 130 Pasadena residents, concerned residents from 15 nearby cities, and 7 groups. I also rise to express concern regarding a troubling fallacy I've heard repeatedly asserted by council members. It's troubling to hear council members seek to circumvent the AB 571 state default limits by claiming contribution limits unfairly favors incumbents and disadvantages challengers. In my view, this is intellectually dishonest and is against the weight of the evidence, the consensus of nonpartisan good government organizations, legislative findings and purposes of AB 571, and the wishes of the people of California and City Pasadena. The legislative findings of AB 571 notes of the 124 local jurisdictions identified as having adopted local campaign contribution limits, only one had a limit higher than 4,700. It also noted that more than 90% of the cities that had adopted limits had limits of $1,000 or less. The legislative history also lays out the following legislative intent of the bill. Quote, in recent years, there have been examples of 50,000, 100,000, even 244,000 contributions to candidates for local office from donors with business before that local government. Such massive campaign contribution creates serious risk of actual or perceived corruption. For this reason, state law prevents a donor from contributing more than 4,700 to candidates for the state assembly or senate. AB 571 sets default local campaign contribution limits for local, city, and county elections, setting a new standard for these local elections. It continues on to say, AB 571 takes an important step
Your time has expired.
Widespread application of campaign contribution limit to prevent.
Ms. Yost, please bring your comments to a close.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Your time has expired. Can you bring your comments to a close, please?
Okay, sure. I just urge the committee to stand with their families and communities in calling for rescinding the council's August 16 vote regarding contribution limits and convening a citizens task force to make recommendations for placing reasonable limits on funding of local campaigns in Pasadena, following the lead of dozens of other Southern California cities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Andrea Davis, followed by Alan Finkelpearl.
Thank you. It's Dr. Andrea Davis. I'm a business owner. I own Greenhouse Therapy Center, where we employ 40 mental health therapists, and I wanted to just weigh in today. I spoke at the larger meeting, but to the committee, I want to say how thankful I am that you brought Mr. Stein. I think his analysis, his data and his logic were impeccable. And I would just request that everything that he mentioned and presented would be considered really representing what the bulk and majority of us who have been trying to write in or speak are trying to say, that the most important thing is we do what we can at this point to make progress in terms of democracy, to make it possible for everybody to have a fair and level chance to contribute. And honestly, a couple being able to contribute $10,000 is quite a bit of power if we did nothing. I think we should be more like similar other progressive cities around us who think about a more reasonable, fairer limit of $1,000. The IE issue we can't solve. It's not before the committee today, and I understand what you're saying about the relative impact, but you could reach out and speak to a number of voters and offset the impact of a $35,000 contribution by, speaking to 3 couples who could donate $30,000 after you met with them and convinced them that that needs to happen. So it's not impossible to offset that. I honestly feel that we're all saying the same thing, that this is what Mr. Stein has presented is impeccable research. It's based on study across the state and nation. We should listen to him.
Your time has expired.
Instead of just going back to what happened in the last race. That's not so relevant as what Mr. Stein has said. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Alan Finkelpearl, followed by Julie McCune.
Ms. Finkelpearl,
Okay,
welcome.
yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak. I would just reiterate what was said before, that the speaker was incredibly powerful and expresses what we all feel, but with a background of knowledge that not all of us share. So what I really hope is that you go in a positive direction and keep the real goal in front of you in good faith to find ways to make elections more fair so that the community can elect the best candidates, the ones that promote their values and the good of the city, not the ones with the most money. The goal is to level the playing field so the candidates without connections to wealthy donors have a chance, and most importantly, to limit the undue influence of those elected, resulting from large donations. I just feel like there's so many excuses out there not to enact the kind of reasonable limits that our speaker suggested. We need lower limits than 4,900 and certainly not unlimited contributions. As the speaker said, there are ways that independent expenditures can be publicized. It was pretty clear that we saw that that $35,000 contribution came from an apartment, I forget the exact name, but right, from a kind of apartment lobbying group. And these things can be done, right? Everybody has to fill out forms 461, 462, 496. These are forms that are public, and the city council could create a website devoted to publicizing these if the issue is that we want sunshine on the contributions. So just do the right thing and create limits. And I also would request that the speaker's comments be shared with the entire city council, because they were incredibly
Your time has expired.
persuasive.
If I may, Mr. Chair, Ms. Finkelpearl, thank you for weighing in. The concern I have beyond the disclosure is a candidate's able to disown the independent expenditure and say, look, I had nothing to do with it, I don't control it. And then the voters, see a candidate who is spending maybe less money directly, but more money through the independent expenditure. That's another concern that I have is, my opponent can say, well, I had nothing to do with that. That was, some people who were very interested in Pasadena all the way from Sacramento.
Next speaker is Julie McCune, followed by Dr. Jean Wester.
Ms. McCune, welcome. You can begin.
Yes, I have just unmuted. Greetings to members of the Legislative Policy Committee and community members. I'm a strong supporter of limits on campaign contributions in Pasadena city elections of the mayor and city council. Do we want justice for our community? Do we as a community wish to limit the amount of corruption? If we continue with the status quo, then only the wealthy property owners will be represented. During budget conversations or zoning conversations or excessive use of force by the Pasadena Police Department, this council has a voting record that favors the few in the ruling class, often ignoring the renters and the working families, and especially the immigrant families. Is there justice when our city council votes to increase the pay of the city manager while our public school teachers remain one of the lowest paid in the San Gabriel Valley? Where is the justice with all these inequities? Let's get money out of politics. Followthemoney.org provides info and data. I'm going to read a quote. The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerated the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Jean Wester.
Thank you, ma'am. And if I could, Ms. Flores, just, the statements about corruption have been quite expansive of late, and I'm not aware of any evidence of any corruption in Pasadena city government. If anyone is, I would ask them to send evidence of that corruption to me and to the city clerk, city attorney, and city manager promptly. Thank you. Please proceed to the next speaker.
Dr. Jean Wester, followed by Maddie Gravel Briggs. Mr. Wester, please unmute.
There we go. Yes, I'm a resident of Pasadena for decades, and I want to speak in favor of the reduced spending campaign limits below 4,900, the state allowance, and I think there's several justifications for that. It really gives more people the opportunity to participate at a meaningful level and forces campaigns to be responsive to the majority of people rather than just a handful of selected large contributors. Secondly, I think there's been a very persuasive presentation made today, followed up by numerous commenters ahead of me that strongly endorse the benefits of smaller campaign limits than the state level, particularly for Pasadena as it relates to comparable cities. That number is, and I asked council to be cognizant that the speakers today have soundly coming down in favor of the smaller campaign limits, and I urge you to recognize who your constituents are and give some credit to that rather than defending the status quo or a personal desire for higher limits. Anyway, that's what I wish to say today, and I hope you will do the right thing and listen to the people. That's it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Maddie Gavel Briggs, followed by Cynthia Kennedy.
Hi there. My name is Maddie Gable Briggs, and it's been some time since I've addressed this city council, but I want to stand in support of the limitation of the campaign contributions. I had planned a few other things to say that basically repeat what a lot of people have already said, so I don't think I need to go there. One of the things that I found really interesting though, Mayor, is I think you're the biggest advocate for being able to do something about these independent expenditures. they're just a real blight on our democracy. The problem is that we can't, our hands are tied. One of the things that the city can do is to perhaps take up the priority of making them more visible. I know that they are required to post them on a website and, you know, just a whole page of the IEs. And I mean, there certainly are things in place that, you know, forms that have to be filled out for anything that's larger than $1,000. So anyone who's willing can follow the trail, and we're all pretty savvy now in doing searches of who these mysterious PACs are. So people can find out, but it would be great if the city did put a little real effort behind that and pushed it towards greater visibility. That would help us all kind of know what's out there and what's happening. Because yeah, it's not right when a candidate, you know, says they're going to take a pledge against not taking funds. The other candidate just kind of comes out of the blue and says, well, I had nothing to do with that PAC, you know, creating that attack ad. It's just wrong. So I would just like to reiterate that. My last comment is basically that my husband and I were part of Occupy Democracy a number of years ago, and we stood in that chamber in September of 2013 when the city council at the present time voted for a resolution against citizens.
Your time has expired.
I'll finish by saying it joined over 800 cities in the country voting against that, and I really want to hope that the council stays to the spirit of keeping the limits and keeping an eye on our democracy. Thank you so much, and thank you for all what you do, especially during COVID and just showing up every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gavel-Briggs. Next speaker.
Cynthia Kennedy, followed by Sam Morrissey.
Hello.
Hi, Ms. Kennedy. Please proceed.
Thank you. The answer to the problem Mayor Gordo raises, which is it's a good issue, but it seems to me the answer is to address IEs and require conspicuous disclosure, which is not prohibited by Citizens United. Mr. Stein described some cities that have done just this. I urge the council to study this and consider enacting such an ordinance. The answer is not to compound the problem. There are evident conflicts of interest risks associated with city council votes on private contracts when the council members have accepted donations from interested parties. Unfortunately, there is no city rule or law that prevents a council member from accepting a campaign contribution before voting on a public benefit that helps the donor, with the exception of a very narrow pre-contractual blackout rule. The Pasadena Taxpayer Protection Act, TPA, applies in the situation where a council member receives a campaign contribution after voting on a donor's public benefit. But even that prohibition disappears 1 year after expiration of the official's term of office at the time he voted, 1 year after he leaves the office, or 5 years from the vote, whichever is first. That brings us to the second risk, which is conflict of interest related to public policies. The TPA does not apply at all to a situation where a union, an association, a company, or an individual makes a donation and then seeks a quid pro quo in terms of public policy. How can city officials exercise their fiduciary duty to citizens to insist, for example, on prompt and objective investigation of police misconduct allegations if they accept unlimited campaign donations from police unions?
Your time has
and
expired.
or individuals associated with law enforcement. In closing, I would suggest that the very purpose of AB 571 was to avoid this exact kind of problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy.
Sam Morrissey, followed by Sonia Burnt.
Sam, welcome.
Thank you. I've submitted a letter, and in the interest of time, I'd like to share some comments in response to the discussion I've heard this afternoon. The city of Englewood has a population of 109,000 people compared to Pasadena's 140,000. They have 65,000 registered voters compared to Pasadena's 85,000. They have a similar council and mayor structure and similar large entertainment venues generating high levels of local tax revenue. In November of last year, they went down the route Pasadena is proposing, and their council approved an individual campaign contribution limit of $100,000 per person. Do we as residents of Pasadena want to go down this similar path? Do we want to entertain the same types of scandals and political malfeasance we've seen in cities like Englewood? It's interesting to note that the mayor of Englewood used the same argument as Pasadena's Mayor Gordo in supporting this astronomical campaign contribution limit, noting that the increase allows a candidate to compete against political action committees, which are not bound by contribution limits. Mayor Gordo similarly postulated that these committees lack transparency and somehow provide an advantage to incumbent elected officials. This is a red herring argument, as the Fair Political Practices Commission clearly describes how campaign committees are different from individual campaign contributors. All three types of committees are required to disclose their funding and campaign contributions via the FPCC, so there's a level of transparency in place. For example, the Form 495 presented by Mayor Gordo earlier in this meeting is an attachment to Form 450, also filed by the recipient committee, which contains more information. The current statewide default limit on individual donations of $4,900 should be sufficient or more than sufficient to a city like Pasadena. It requires candidates to actually engage with local residents, to speak to the actual issues faced by local residents. Further, as you all just heard from city staff earlier, maintaining the state de facto limits would save the city money by allowing the FPCC to regulate and monitor those contributions. There's no reasonable argument to support this proposed ordinance. Therefore, I urge you to recommend that the City Council reject this proposed ordinance. Thank you.
Mr. Morrissey, I would challenge you to look at to see what's happened in Englewood and with independent expenditures, and maybe you know the answer. I'd ask if you do, if you can just tell us what's happened.
I don't know if I'm still muted, but that's exactly the types of political malfeasance I'm talking about. So
yeah,
I don't think we need to have a high limit like they do as well.
Well, I would invite the public to look to see what's happened in Englewood with independent expenditures and the level of expenditure that it's triggered. And you have a council and a mayor who are able to say, got nothing to do with it, to go talk to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Sam.
Next speaker is Sonia Byrne, followed by Ed Wishaka.
And then can I inquire, Madam Clerk, how many more cards after that?
We have 5 more cards after Ed Wishaka.
Okay, well, we're right about at 4 p.m. And Julie, can you remind me what our constraint is at 4 p.m.?
Yes, we actually have the Municipal Services Committee meeting. We have staff on here already, and I believe the other ones are waiting. The other members of the City Council who are on MSC are waiting in the lobby.
Okay, well, I would ask the final speakers to please be economical. I think it's clear that the consensus of the speakers, at least so far, is to urge us, as many of you have in the council meeting, to adopt some form, either the state or our own form of campaign finance reform. So, but please proceed, Ms. Byrne.
Good afternoon. At its October 18th meeting, the majority of the council failed to even mention the purposes of campaign contribution limits, not disclosure, but the avoidance of corruption and undue influence and the appearance of it. Undue influence and the appearance of it are evident in our own city. Most of our council members have taken substantial campaign donations from Pasadena's police union. During the pandemic, the council repeatedly approved very substantial funding requests whenever PPD approached the council, even with biased, bare bones, non-source staff reports. Here are just a few of those. 1, the council approved an operating budget for the police department with over $84 million from the general fund. In contrast, the housing department gets almost nothing from the general fund. The council approved the transfer of $1 million in excess funds from the city's operating budget toward paying for remodeling of PPD headquarters, new furniture, etc., instead of providing basic shelter to our nearly 300 unsheltered residents. 3, without competitive bidding, the council approved a $420,000 helicopter camera surveillance system to replace a functioning system. And 4, despite the city council's request, Mayor Gordo has failed to agendize a cahoots model mobile crisis response for persons suffering from a mental health crisis because, according to reports, the police union strongly opposes it. Pasadena has been mentioned as one of California's most economically unequal cities. Passing an ordinance allowing the wealthy and special interests to dump huge sums of cash into your campaign bank accounts should be one of the last things you would want to implement. In a compelling guest opinion in Pasadena Now, Margaret McGosson urges the council to convene a citizen task force to examine campaign finance in Pasadena and let our residents have the last word on the issue. I strongly urge you to follow her advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burnt.
Edward Shaka, followed by Tina Fredericks.
Ed, welcome. Ed, you may need to unmute by hitting *6. May we go to the next speaker, Madam Clerk? We can't hear Mr. Washata.
Okay, the next speaker is Tina Fredericks.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Ms. Fredericks, welcome.
Good afternoon, Mayor Gordo and Councilmember Masuda and Councilmember Madison and members of the public. My name is Tina Fredericks, mother of 2 girls, resident of Pasadena, member of the Pasadena Unified School Board, representing my own individual view, not the PSD board. I want to address the misconception that first-time candidates or challengers have a significantly greater advantage given campaign contribution limits. Campaign limits level the playing field, but incumbents will still be at a significantly higher advantage due to the incumbents' already established name recognition, existing relationships with unions, and endorsements from previous campaigns. Campaign contribution limits is an equity issue, leveling the playing field for the average person and powerless versus the ultra-rich, not the rich versus the richer. When you raise money, most of that money goes towards mailers, other advertising that gets your name out there. If there were campaign limits, there's a better chance that you can't raise as much money and you would be forced to knock on more doors and have more conversations on the phone to earn the people's vote. As a Pasadena Unified School Board member, I see this decision affecting the future of our public schools. A majority of PSD children come from low socioeconomic communities who will be out-donated. Our families are already struggling to get by. We will continue to lose PSD families if this great city of Pasadena makes decisions that does not match our community's values. Skyrocketing rents are driving our families out and our enrollment will continue to decline along with our funding. I support maintaining the limiting campaign contributions as enforced by the state. I would also urge continued reform to lower campaign limits to 1,000 or lower, such that low middle income families can afford it. Give PSD children and their families a chance. This community and this world is in crisis. The people need you to represent them. Be brave and further limit campaign contributions. Support representing all people and all children of this community. Thank you.
Amory Thomas, followed by Kathy Quincy.
Mr. Thomas, is Mr. Thomas up next?
Yes, Mr. Thomas?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
My name is Amory Thomas, Pasadena resident, business owner, and criminal justice advocate. In considering any change to our Pasadena campaign finance laws, consider this. Your average Pasadena resident would need to be trained as an accountant, data analyst, or professional researcher to be able to cobble together the multiple filings and documents on the city's campaign finance disclosure website to form a complete picture of all contributions raised by any candidate, either outside or inside of an election cycle. If the city council is genuine about enabling transparency, procedural fairness, and ethics in any new or proposed ordinance, it would direct city resources to provide common sense dashboards, graphs, or summary charts of all funds raised by every candidate from every source. The time spent by this council on this ordinance should have been used to direct transparency of individual expenditures into the brilliant Pasadena sunshine. A quality ordinance would seek to enhance our local campaign finance protections rather than continue to erode or obscure them. So why do all of Pasadena's candidates for office need more money? Why can't they work harder to appear more frequently across our community in person rather than campaign passively from offices and lounge chairs with ads, mailings, and billboards? I'm particularly incensed by the claim of a prominent elected official that your Pasadena community is somehow engaged in an astroturfing campaign against this ordinance by merely speaking out against it. I can assure every member of this council that astroturf is not very popular in your highly diverse, educated, ethical, and environmentally conscious community. but many in this Pasadena community are resentful of being accused of fraud or unethical behavior for simply attending your chambers or notifying you of our desire to hold our elected officials accountable on campaign finance reform. Your Pasadena community deserves an apology for this false claim made during the previous council proceeding. We, the residents of Pasadena, are actively engaged with you, our city council, to prevent any railroading of this ordinance by some, despite widespread community opposition. So let's stick with the state of California's $4,900 limit.
Your time
How
is
about
up.
requiring full disclosure of independent expenditure to the city? Candidates need to make campaign finance limits work by putting in the work, and that's best practice for our local democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Is that our
Kathy?
last comment?
We have 3 more comments.
Okay.
Kathy Cunnins, followed by Allison Henry, followed by Jill Shook.
Now
Please.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can
Yes,
hear you.
please proceed.
In the interest of time, I am simply going to read a summary. My name's Kathy Kunis. I'm reading a summary of a prepared statement from Martha Zavala, President of the League of Women Voters, Pasadena area. We urge you to reject this addition of no limits to the municipal code. Better yet, please work with the citizens of Pasadena to craft an ordinance for campaign finance limits that is more comprehensive and offers more protection from dark money than state law. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Allison Henry, followed by Jill Shook.
Ms. Henry, welcome.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to speak with the committee tonight. Allison Henry, local tenant advocate. Just wanted to say I don't see any real community push for this ordinance. I would say no action is needed, no ordinance. And I would just say Pasadena has many forums and venues for candidates for local office. In this last election cycle, there were multiple candidate forums for each district up for election. I had the pleasure of getting razzed by Mr. Masuda at one, which is great. You know, it was a pleasure to see all these forums. There are lots of community events and meet and greets, whatever way you want to say it. I feel like talk of this ordinance is out of step with what's going on with the community. There's a lot you can do with people and community power that is cheap and cheerful, if I can say, to offset big money. I appreciated Dr. Davis's point about the next elections being a good way to focus on that. And I also appreciate, Mr. Madison, your equity concern. But I would just say the best way to ensure equity is maybe community engagement and outreach through community mechanisms rather than monetary mechanisms. And Mayor Gordo, I was very happy to see you pull the CAA contribution. That needs to be lifted. And I really, you know, in observing the last election cycle and how many folks ran for local office and how many free events there were to talk with the community, I think those sort of expenditures, like you did in several community forums actually, you know, provide good fodder, productive fodder for you as a candidate to educate the community and distance yourself. And the community is not stupid, right? You know, we know the difference between, you know, poo and a good sandwich. And you need to trust your community more. And, you know, the distance that you feel.
Your time has expired.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for listening.
Ms. Henry. Jill Shook is our last speaker.
Yes, Jill Shook.
Ms. Shook.
Please unmute yourself.
Ms. Shook, you're muted.
*6.
Did Ms. Shook submit something in writing?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we can't hear her, so we're going to have to move on in light of the fact that we're over our time. I would ask that we, Madam Clerk, you said that the materials that were submitted in writing had been provided to us. And can I just confirm, can you double check that to make sure that we all have those?
Yes.
And I mean, this has been a good discussion. I'm not sure that we've made any progress. You know, the IEs do seem to be a significant factor here. There is talk from time to time. I know one of our members of the House, Adam Schiff, has talked about legislation that would address Citizens United. That seems to be a complex topic in and of itself. I do want to point out some of the speakers, again, in this legitimate concern about corruption, and negative campaigning. We do have something in Pasadena pursuant to local policy and ordinance that is the Fair Campaign Pledge, where candidates are asked to sign a pledge. And I think many of us have always done that offers to exchange all of our mailers and advertisements some hours in advance. I think it's a couple of days, if I recall. And that way giving the opponents an opportunity to complain if it's unfair or negative, and to respond, more importantly. So we're definitely mindful of these things. I fear with the time here that we need to probably just docket this for another discussion, unless Mayor or Councilmember Masuda, you have a different suggestion.
No, I'm fine with that. I think the record, my interest is in building this record to caution people that, there's a slippery slope, and I did not actually receive satisfying answers from anyone holding out Los Angeles or Los Angeles County or Inglewood as the examples for Pasadena to follow. We are not any of those jurisdictions, and I think people should be very careful when they think through this issue that we're not reducing the cost of a campaign. I would challenge anyone to tell me that a campaign in Los Angeles County, or Inglewood has gone down. What we've done is pushed money into the independent expenditures in all of those communities. And let me also remind you of one thing. It was the Board of Supervisors, it was the LA City Council, all incumbents, who adopted those campaign limits as a form of protecting incumbents. They're incumbent protection measures, in my view. And same thing with the state. When's the last time anyone at the state level has challenged successfully a state senator or a state assembly member, or a member of the Board of Supervisors, or a member of the LA City Council? And the net effect is we get developers contributing IEs, and then we end up with measures like SB 9 that attack our local control, that tear at the very fabric of our municipality. And so I'm prepared to have an open mind, but let me tell you something. It doesn't come without an expense, no pun intended, when you head down this road, because they do become incumbent protection measures. And I'm an incumbent. Mr. Madison is an incumbent. Mr. Masuda is an incumbent. We just ran for office the last time around. And so if anyone should be focused on incumbent protection, it would be the three of us. But that's not what I'm trying to achieve here. What I'm trying to achieve is to raise awareness of what I've witnessed in other jurisdictions, that then becomes a very slippery slope. And the gentleman, Mr. Jonathan from Common Cause, in my view, did not answer the questions that I posed to him in a satisfactory manner. We're not Inglewood, we're not Los Angeles, we're not Torrance, we're not the county.
Okay, Mayor, I take your points. I do have to yield room here to the other committee. I do want to admonish ourselves here that the default right now is we are subject to the state legislation. So I would like to see us put this over to the next Legislative Policy Committee agenda and discuss it again. Obviously, events may overtake us, and we may want to take it straight to the council for another discussion. But obviously, if that occurs, we would make sure that there's really substantial outreach so that the community can participate in this. I think everyone in this debate comes from a place of good faith and fair dealing, and we need to continue to discuss it. And I think the Pasadena way, I have a strong bias in favor of Pasadena deciding what's best for Pasadena in this regard. I think my colleagues do too. We don't have much time. We will have an opportunity at the full council to give a more fulsome farewell to Julie Gutierrez, our wonderful assistant city manager. There are many meetings, I'm sure, where we all wish we were retiring, but Julie, you've really earned it and deserve it. And so we'll look forward to a more formal farewell for you before the full council.
Thank you very much. If I also may mention that in the interim, Matt Hawksworth, our Director of Finance, will actually do the staff duties for this committee. So I'm sure
Great.
he'll be chatting with you, Chair, regarding the next meeting, which does take place during the week of Thanksgiving. In the past, we've normally canceled that, but I'm sure you can have a conversation with Mr. Hawksworth.
Yeah, let's leave it there for now, given the importance of this issue. But my strong sense is many members are traveling and with family, as I would hope everyone has a chance to be, that week. So, but for now, we'll deal with that offline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all very much. This meeting is adjourned.
Let me just say thank you to Julie as well on behalf of residents of Pasadena.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you, Julie.